Well, hello, critical thinking peeps. Now that we've moved into week 5 and you all are working on your first drafts, I wanted to give you a little bit of help with structuring your argument. And what this is called is the Toulmin model. I'm going to open a screen share here. If you just bear with me for a moment. There we go. Hopefully it'll also come up shortly. Yeah, it looks like we can see that we can all see that now. Okay. So the Toulmin model is usually considered pretty basic structure for both public speaking and for structuring an essay, a persuasive essay. So what we're dealing with here are basically three important elements or foundational elements of your argument, which would be the claim, and this is in most cases anyway, your thesis, the data, the facts or evidence used to prove the argument, and of course, something that you might not be familiar with, the warrant or the warrants. You may have multiple ones potentially. The general, hypothetical, and often implicit logical statements that serve as bridges between the claim and the data. So what I want you to know right away, okay, with this, before I even show you an example of how this works, is that the warrant, so we're very clear, the warrant is supposed to show the relationship between your claim and your data. In other words, how the data proves your claim, proves the claim that you're making. In a sense, proves your argument. Okay. Obviously, you guys have multiple elements of your argument. You're making, for example, let's say you're making a claim, or you probably should be anyway, making a claim in all three of your subtopics, right? So you're going to have three of those potentially. I mean, maybe some people have more than three, but you're definitely going to have three. And each one of those is essentially a statement that you're trying to prove or a claim that you're trying to prove. So your data is your evidence, the research, the references that you've accumulated. Okay. So now we're going to take a look at an example of this. And of course, Aristotle, this is one of my favorite quotes, always prove what you state. It's a really, simple idea from Aristotle, but it's definitely one that we should always keep in mind when we're crafting arguments. So the example is, I want to mention this too, there's other elements of the Toulmin model in this example, which I will explain, but you don't have to use them. Rebuttal is something that you'll probably want to use to make your argument stronger, because it almost always does. If you can, give an example of a rebuttal, something that somebody might be making an argument against your claims, and then you essentially are going to argue against that rebuttal, argue against their claim, and provide evidence for that as well. But this one has an example of animal research. And I use this one in part because I'm a big believer, and I don't believe anything should be tested on animals that couldn't be tested on humans. In other words, we could test humans instead of animals for these things. Now, the person that's making this argument is saying that this ban should not apply to medical research. Okay. Now, I guess in principle, agree with that, of course. But that's their qualifier. That's not something that you have to worry about. You're making a claim Congress should ban animal research. And then they're going on to say that because animals are tortured in experiments that have no necessary benefit for humans, such as the testing of cosmetics. Now, there's going to be data. The data is actually, in this case, and going back to that previous slide for a moment, the facts or evidence, okay? So this particular set of data is really just a fact. They have no necessary benefit for humans. Now, somebody may try to rebut that or refute that, right? And maybe you want to have evidence that shows that. And maybe you do. Maybe you do have evidence, or whatever the subject that you're covering. Maybe when you're presenting a fact that's not necessarily research-based, but it probably is. I guess that's why I'm bringing this up. So we go on to the warrant. The well-being of animals is more important than the profits of the cosmetics industry. I tend to agree with this too, but the point here is we want to make sure that that warrant, that statement, is proving or is making the case for your claim. So in a sense, when we said earlier, when we said that about implicit, let me go back to the previous slide again real quick. Remember, the warrant is a general, hypothetical, and often implicit. It doesn't always exactly mirror what you said in your claim. Oftentimes, your claim will sound almost exactly like your warrant, okay? But you still have to show the relationship or help us to understand why your data proves your claim, okay, and makes the case for your claim. So you're proving your argument with the warrant. The warrant is the bridge, as it said before, between your data and your claim, or your claim and your data, okay? Only Congress has the authority to make such a law. That's probably a good bridge between the data and the claim, okay? It might be a little faulty. You might want to think about something like that if you're making the case here. And they go on to say, because the corporations can simply move from state to state to avoid legal penalties. That's backing as well. That's another aspect of the research. But again, this is one of the elements of the Toulmin model that you don't have to use. I just want you guys to focus on the claim, the data, and the warrant or warrants, okay? A law to ban all research would go too far because this ban should not apply to medical research. That's a qualifier. The ban should not apply to medical research. Again, you don't have to do this, but it might be super helpful for your argument. A law to ban all research would go too far. And that's the rebuttal that somebody would be arguing. We shouldn't ban all this research because we need it, at least as far as in medical research, okay? So again, with this particular model and this way of structuring your argument, you wouldn't necessarily have to put the claim, data, and warrant in your paper, in your essay, but it might help you to do that. You might want to, under each subtopic, state your claim, put the word claim there, and then what your claim is there in the first one, and then present your data, your evidence, your facts, sometimes even opinion, as long as your whole thing isn't opinion, okay? Because in a way, I don't know. For all we know, maybe some of you might know this, but because animals are tortured in experiments that have no necessary benefit to humans, that might not necessarily, that might just be opinion. Anyway, but that is the data. That is part of the data anyway. There's more data. There could potentially be more data. In fact, I think there would probably be stronger evidence to prove this claim. And then, of course, the third element of this is the warrant, where you explain to us the relationship between your claim and your data, or your data and your claim, how your data, your evidence, proves your claim. And you do that for each one of your claims, because you're going to have probably at least three, right? Well, I think you required essentially in the essay, in the instructions for the essay, to have three of those. In other words, those are the subtopics. Those are the arguments you're making for this. You have an overarching argument, okay? Your thesis statement, for example, that's your overarching argument. But then you have your individual points you want to make and arguments, kind of like sub-arguments, because we call them subtopics, right? I think that's what we call them, don't we? Anyway, okay, so obviously, if you guys have any questions about this as you're going through it, do not hesitate to contact me. But I think this could really help you structure your persuasive essay. And I appreciate your attention, guys.